Julio. Okay.
We made the smartest jokes possible. We're
We're
the
brilliant.
greatest.
We're
We're
absolutely
brilliant.
brilliant.
Is this
We're
working?
comedic geniuses.
Okay, it's
Exactly.
working.
There's no one
Okay.
Who
funnier
could have
under the
seen?
sun.
Nope. I would high five you. Like, high five.
Okay, so for the people who are coming in, we are talking about all about love. And we are talking about chapter 7. It is called Greed, Simply Love. And we're just going over how I personally really was upset with this chapter, and I like some of the things I brought up was just like how she talks, like Corin brought up actually, like how she talks about drug use and just feeling uncomfortable about that. For me, like the way she talks about poor people at points seems really condescending. And then Tom was talking about how she has a second house and kind of just said that casually. And like, I wonder if I think there are a lot of times there are rich people who want to help the poor, maybe have like the right ideologies, but then don't realize like how messed up they're being. Kind of like with white people, how like white people are like racism's bad, but they are just in their like white bubble, and so they don't understand. They'll say racist stuff without even realizing it, even though their hearts are in the right place. And we're just like talking a little bit about that. But then for me, the part that was like so like just I actually can't read this book anymore because she talks about Monica Lewinsky. And for those of you who aren't familiar with that, it's when Bill Clinton was president, he had a sexual relation with someone who worked at the White House who was a lot younger. And I think that's why he was impeached, because he's, had sex with someone else. And that whole scenario is just super weird to me because I don't even know if like Hillary knew about it. Like if Hillary knows about it and it's all consensual and they're all consenting adults, like it's not, and it's literally a non-issue. And then like people went after Monica Lewinsky. They were like, you're a whore. People were calling her a whore. People were so sexist about it, and they just focus on her. And the way Bell Hooks talks about her is just like, from a feminist, for me, it's like that's just a no. This is my first Bell Hooks book I've read or ever read. I read excerpts that I really appreciated. And yeah, this is just like a hard no for me. So I'm going to talk with the rest of my book club. We only have a couple people here today. So I'm going to like ask around. I know someone else really liked it in this book club and like see if he wants to continue it. But I'm just going to head out. I'm going to dip out of this book club. Like not right now. Like this is going to be the last one that I'm in. But yeah, that's what we're talking about right now. Corin, Tom, sorry, I just kind of started the stream and started talking. Is there anything you wanted to add?
You basically covered what we talked about so far, the casual classism, the drug addiction problems, and what you mentioned that I was too young to know about.
Yeah, that pretty much sums. I mean, along with these critiques, my critique was mainly just presentation-wise. It was just how the book is structured, how it's written. It is something that's come up, I think, also in previous discussion we've had about the book, that it can sometimes be quite esoteric or vague, which is sad because in her kind of manifesto, so to speak, right at the beginning, she's saying, I want to demystify love. I want to make it something that's no longer treated as vague or unknowable. I want to demystify it, and unfortunately, it still left me very mystified, which is a shame. But that's a minor thing compared to the other the other stuff, I think.
No, I think that's a huge component of the book as well. Like, because I think for me, like, I think it speaks to people, like, because I'm just like, what is she like? I'm constantly thinking, what is she talking about? And to other people, they're like, this is so powerful. This speaks to me, and it reminds me a little bit of like when you get your fortune read, and it says something that's like general enough for everyone to understand, and to it's going to
Yeah.
speak to you in the way that it needs to speak to you, but it's going to look, I think that actually does like look different for everyone, which I think can be fine. But I think that's a little bit what's going on here, where it's like really vague, but the
Hmm.
person who's reading it can think of examples in their own life and be like, okay, like this really speaks like truth and power to my life, but it's actually very vague. And I think for some people that's great. I think for me, I was hoping to get like a little bit of, I was hoping to get something more concrete out of this
Yeah.
book. So for me, it's not working personally, but if people are getting something out of this book, I think that's great, and I don't want to stop them from it.
I got some out of like the first few chapters, but then after that, it got more and more vague.
Yeah. Same. It was kind of like it started off well, and then it kind of petered out a bit. It's like, oh yeah, I like these these goals that she's setting. Like I agree with the main precept of it, that there is a general kind of, there's almost like a taboo about talking about love, uh and the way it's taught about, the way it's represented in media, like all of these really good points for discussion. Um, and they're there at the beginning, and then it's a shame. It really is. Uh, I also had the hope that it would be. I mean, especially about the part about loving yourself. Um, I got more out of our discussion about that chapter than I did from the chapter itself, um, which was interesting. Because yeah, there were a lot of things that again felt like you said, this kind of bubble mentality. It's like, oh, affirmations aren't going to cut it for everyone. I mean, is there more? Is there more bell hooks? Do you have more tips? But alas,
Yeah.
I
Affirmations,
did.
if you don't believe any of the affirmations while you're saying them, and then like as it goes on, it kind of feels like just saying, uh, drug addiction kind of just felt like, oh, just don't be addicted to drugs. You're using this instead of something else. But really, like, you're on drugs. A lot of the time, it's because there is something else you need and cannot have that.
Yeah, I underlined that part,
Hmm.
and let's just even go to it. Like,
Hmm.
so this is on page 110. Uh, so imagine a mother living in poverty who has always taught her children the difference between right and wrong, who has taught them to value being honest because she wants to provide them with a moral and ethical universe, who suddenly accepts a child selling drugs because it brings into the home financial resources for both necessary and unnecessary expenses. Her ethical values are eroded by the intensity of longing and lack, but she no longer sees herself as living at odds with the consumer culture she lives in. She has become connected, one with a culture of consumption and driven by its demands. Love is not a topic she thinks about. Her life has been characterized by a lack of love. She has found it makes life easier when she hardens her heart and turns her attention towards more attainable goals, acquiring shelter, food, making ends meet, and finding ways to satisfy desires for little material luxuries. Thinking about love may simply cause her pain. She and hordes of women like her have had enough pain. She may even turn to addiction to experience the pleasure and satisfaction she never found when seeking love. Widespread addiction in both poor and affluent communities is linked to our psychotic lust for material consumption. It keeps us unable to love, um, fixating on wants and
Uh,
needs. Like, I think one thing I want to just like point out is just the way she uses like narcissism, the way she uses the word psychotic. It's super
yeah.
ableist, and then it's also just like these are like narcissism's like literally a personality disorder. Like you don't just like throw that around for like
No.
that's something that like needs to be diagnosed. You don't just like willy nilly be like talk about like the narcissism of like I don't know, she's like is like kind of creating these terms out of like a psychological like state of being, and like it just really bothered me. But then like, the psychotic lust, like Jesus, like sorry, sorry, Courtney, I don't want to. I'm gonna try not to use that word.
I'm not offended by that. Don't worry.
I'll try not to. Okay. It's Tovio. Hey, Tovio. We are just talking about how she's talking about drugs, like the psychotic lust, though. Like that's just something where I'm just like, it just seems so judgmental, and like, when I hear people say that, I wonder if they know anyone who has grown up in poverty and then also been exposed to drugs, or they're in situations where they feel like they have to sell drugs to just get by, or people who get addicted to drugs, like in these poor communities. Like maybe she does know people like that, but I guess for me, like knowing people have been in those instances, and then like also hearing people's stories about that, like to me that just sounds like so condescending. Like I would just never talk about it like in that way, and that really was like upsetting for me to read. Just like that in itself was just like upsetting, to like the way she's talking about that. But I don't want to take over. I could be very passionate and very opinionated, so I don't want anyone to feel like they can't just like talk. Yeah, I don't want to take over anything, but yeah, I was wondering what you all were thinking about that.
Yeah, like I understand that it's a really common type of ableism to use personality disorders as descriptors of something that is bad, instead of recognizing that they are indeed personality disorders, and people with personality disorders aren't necessarily bad people. Um, but at the same time, like, it's not okay. Ableism is everywhere in general. It's still not
Mhm.
okay, and it's something people need to try to work through. And I feel like when you're using psychotic in that specific way, an instance, like that's more recognizable as something that's bad. People don't always think about personality disorders as like a real thing when they're doing it, which is not good. But like psychotic, I feel like it's easier to understand why that's bad to say.
Especially if someone's like dealing with addiction, like
Yeah.
that seems like super
Yeah.
mean. I don't know, that seemed like mean, but like I don't think that's what her intentions were.
It comes across as both dehumanizing, because it's like sentence after sentence, like this hypothetical person doesn't even know the concept of love. They're only driven by,
Yeah,
yeah, it's like it's stripping back everything. It's just
like the fuck
taking
do you
all
know?
of,
Sorry, I'm sorry.
yeah. No,
Yeah,
no, I was gonna
unloving
say,
about
it's like,
just wanting to. What's unloving about just wanting to survive? There's nothing unloving about surviving
yeah,
and wanting your family to survive.
And there's plenty of people who struggle with addiction who, I mean, I definitely know that like when people struggle with addiction, it can like take over their whole lives, that they can't be loving. And there's also people who struggle with addiction who are like known as being very loving people, who are struggling with addiction, but they are still very loving. And not that addiction can't get in the way of that, but it's just like, it just seems like it's a very binary way of looking at it, and dehumanizing to people going through that. um yeah,
it
like
feels
Especially,
also like, sorry.
okay, especially because I think that a lot of times it's the other way. It's not that people who are addicted to substances are unloving. It's that they don't have access to community, to the resources they need to survive, and to other things, which makes addiction kind of just what they need to get through life at that point, because they don't have access to the connection, to the people, to basic needs for survival to do so. It's just a way to get through.
and then also like a lot of the addictions that people struggle with, like literally the war on drugs was like cultivated on purpose. Like the government literally
Yeah.
injected cocaine like like into, just like into like our into the like just in I don't know, injected into where, I'm not saying this very well, but like the government like literally like were the people pushing cocaine, and this isn't even a conspiracy theory, and there's like all these like instances where there's like these like mass addiction events where people, you know, with heroin that happened because they like approved oxycodone, even though there's like all these studies being like, oh, actually this is like not really like helping with pain, but it makes people feel good. And also people, it's highly addictive. So you have all these people getting on oxycodone and they can't get a prescription for it, and they move to heroin. And they knew that when they were like pushing these drugs. Like there's like all these like things like into these like epidemics, these drug epidemics, and that's like I don't know, it's like pretty extreme, and like those aren't. It's just like the way that like she's just like blaming people, and especially like poor people. I'm just like, it's just kind of hard on me, or it's not hard on me. It's like hard for me to. I just like read that and I'm like,
yeah.
I'm a head out. Like I can't. Yeah.
It really reads like someone who's like I'm fine. I mean, I don't particularly enjoy thought experiments, you know, things like the trolley experiment and things like that, because I always feel like they only go so far in being helpful, because they're always hypothetical. But it really feels like this is such a hypothetical person. It's like, imagine this person who this and this and this and this and this, and it's like it's like when oh god, there's like that meme on Twitter. Is like Twitter is almost 100% people inventing a person who they think does horrible things just so they can get angry about this person that does horrible things. The person in question does not exist. It's a hypothetical that they use to push a secondary argument, or even a tertiary one. It's like, oh, if X, Y, and Z happened, then I would do this, or this would be fine. You know, there's always like this hypothetical situation, and it feels very. That probably compounds the dehumanization, because it's just like, imagine this person, like go with me on this, because otherwise the point's not gonna it's not gonna sound, and it doesn't sound convincing either way, because there's ableism, there's a lack of class consciousness, there's a lack of understanding of just a poor person's existence, many poor people's existence, and it's like,
Like even if she did know this person, you know, that would almost be worse in some ways. Like if you knew someone going through this, and that's how you talked about them. Like that's just, I don't know. It just seems like some bougie, like kind of like, I don't know. It just, I don't know. I don't know her experiences on this.
I assume that it's a hypothetical just because it doesn't read like someone who knows. To me, like. It does read very bougie. It reads very much like, oh, you know, I've heard that there are people who.
But then it's even like also an issue where like people, you can like picture like this stereotype of like, you know, the people doing drugs, those poor people doing drugs. You know what I'm talking about. They don't have love. And it's just like,
yeah.
Yeah, I'm just thinking about like you've heard me tell these stories, Lua, about when I was a kid and I'd watch Saturday morning cartoons, and in between cartoons or like during the commercial breaks, you know, like a commercial would come on and it would be like this washed out cold blue light, and it would be like just all these like short stutter frames of somebody shooting up heroin, right? And it was just like in a park, like in a playground, like it's just really really kind of intense scene. And then, you know, they show the hypodermic and everything, and then they cut to a clip that's like, if you're going to share needles, wash them out with bleach, right? And this is like where I grew up. There was just so much. There's such a rampant drug issue, right? And it went from being, this is like rural. This is very rural, and it went from being heroin to being crack, right? And just the strangely, for as horrifying as these commercials were, and you're just a kid, and reason they're on. It was also very humanizing in another way, right? Where it's like, oh, well, it's not about this person being bad. It's about like, hey, clean your needles. Although I think they could have done that in a much kinder way. But yeah, I mean, this stuff from the stuff in Bell Hooks, like in All About Love, like I don't think she's like it just seems like castigation of addiction to me. Like it just seems like, oh, well, these people made their bed, now they're lying in it. You don't need to be they're incapable of love. And that the scary thing about that is like, like, well, if they're incapable of love, then you're not obligated to care about them, right? It's like that hurts me on some like fundamental level. It's sort of like, oh, you can't love other people until you love yourself. Well, then that's sort of like the message of that is like telling a bunch of people that they shouldn't bother loving people who can't love themselves effectively or who don't love themselves effectively. That seems like a recipe for disaster.
I don't know if she
like,
is. I don't know if she is saying that with. I think she's trying to say like they can't love. I don't think she's making the argument that someone can't love them. I think she's saying that they're incapable of loving people, and I think that's also like not necessarily true. I've definitely met people who are addicted, and because of their addictions, the addictions they have are so severe that they actually like can't really have these loving. Oh my gosh! Ow! Sorry, my cat's just like walking on me, but like her claws are just out. It's like ripping into my skin. Oh my gosh! No, sorry. But like, I forgot what I was saying. Oh, I think it's like I just think that's like a really like I wish she had given like a specific example, but she just like says like, oh, someone's just like addicted to drugs. I met people who have addictions who are still very loving, and things are also hard or more complicated, or things are harder, but they still can be very loving people. And then I've also met people who are their addictions are so out of control, depending on the substance too, because certain things that you're addicted to, like you kind of just like can't really quite be there, where they really can't have any loving relationships because it's taken over their life. And yeah, but it's definitely more complicated. It's more complicated than that. That's the drug. Like when people are addicted to meth, like they're like addicted to meth and it really sucks and they just pretty much have to not ever do meth again. And that's the drug though. There's just like all these like things, specific drugs that I'm thinking of. But she doesn't say that. She just like talks like about like this general drug addiction. And just, sorry, my cat, it just like really hurts. She's being very sweet, but it just is very painful. All right, get down there.
Never apologize for cat. Instead, get the cat its own camera so it can stream alongside you.
Yeah, sometimes she likes to sit back up here. Oh! She's back. Okay, I should have worn thicker pants today. Oh gosh, I'm sorry. Yeah, okay.
Yeah. Like as a cat owner, your wardrobe slowly evolves into just like thick denim, like some kind of suit of armor.
But yeah, I just think the thing about like with bell hooks, I think just like these broad generalizations and then like just talking about it like as psychotic lust just doesn't seem like in touch with people who have drug addictions. It also completely depends on the drug they're addicted to. All these things, all these factors, like it's kind of like, it just like is, to me it's like so much more complicated than the way that she stated it. And
there's a friend of mine who does a bunch of what do you call it, ink transfer or carved stamps basically, and does like a massive amount of art. Like he did something like 365 stamps one year, like big, foot by foot stamps, and just like a whole library of things. And all the stamps are like experientially about having type 1 diabetes. And he draws this parallel between he does this, and I'm not saying this is a valid parallel for anybody else, but like, oh well, you're addicted to insulin, like you have to have it, and he draws that parallel very clearly with addictions to heroin, and part of like um I think part of the advocacy that he's doing in the making of that art is saying, okay, well, we can humanize to some degree, we can humanize like type 1 diabetes, and how can we not humanize like drug addiction? Like like in both cases, you're like depending on the drug, you're kind of flirting with death quite a bit, and if you don't do it right, so there are these experiential things, like with, say, heroin addiction or having type 1 diabetes, these experiential things where somebody is sitting like at the edge of their mortality, right? They're committing an act that has a level of morbidity, and um, it's weird that people can't make that extra connection over there. To me, it's weird that people can't be like, oh well, why would we not humanize this the need that this person has that puts them in the situation where um, this is what they need in their life,
It's not really that weird to me, just because like there are people who will think that even doctors who will think that using a wheelchair or using crutches or any kind of other mobility equipment is causing you to develop a dependence on those instead of you needing them. And then like I've had issues getting my testosterone because it's considered a controlled substance to being a steroid. Um, and they do still treat a lot of medically required things similar to the way they treat drugs. I know that a lot of chronic pain people um, who don't get any relief from any other medications have a lot of trouble getting access to opioids when opioids is what they actually need, and will be treated like addicts or like drug seekers by the doctors for trying to get the medications. So like a lot of it is rooted back to ableism in general because people will act like anything you need to survive is something that you're trying to develop a dependence on. I've even seen a few instances where people acted like people with asthma were getting dependent on their inhalers. Ridiculous, but
Yeah, that stuff really, really bothers me. It's like a personal, uh, it's a pet peeve of mine, to put it lightly. I feel like it's a bit of an understatement. That yeah.
Yeah, that I've known people with chronic pain who, because of the limitations on their prescriptions, um, they'll mix opioids with alcohol, right? And they've like figured out their formula for doing that, so that they're like, it's like they shouldn't have to do that, but nobody seems to believe that they need, like that they're nobody seems to sorry, the doctors don't seem to believe in their level of need, right? So
Mm-hmm.
they end up taking things upon themselves, and that puts them in a more precarious situation. It's really really an extreme dynamic.
Yeah, and it's like so common with doctors. Um.
um Sorry, go
Oh,
ahead.
what are you gonna say?
Oh, I think, well, there's something I said a little bit ago that I think maybe I didn't say very well, but um, around the story of, you know, um, people, like, let's say people with addiction aren't capable of love, right? Like that premise, like um, that premise, and abstractly more like people who aren't capable of loving themselves, aren't capable of loving other people. I think those stories, those premises, um, I don't think bell hooks is saying, oh, you shouldn't love those people, but I think those premises end up being like a justification for people to decide not to care about people. And um, I think that's more what I was trying to say earlier. I don't think that came across very well when I said it first.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think there's like a stigma around people who have addiction, and so it's like people like stuff like this kind of like promotes this like, well, they're not going to be able to love you back because like they can't be very loving, so just you got to do what's best for you and move on with your life. And I don't think that's what Bell Hooks is directly saying. I just think I think what she's saying contributes to that stigma. And I do think like if, people need to make their own boundaries and, opt in to who they want to be with and all of that. And addiction certainly can be a reason to be like, I can't keep on being with this person because the addiction issues are so extreme and severe. That's totally valid. And also like, I have seen instances where people are just so judgmental around this stuff. And that's not even, like there's like this kind of people immediately like typecast people as some sort of extreme. That's like not really what's going on. And like, because of the stigma around it. So I think that's kind of what bothered me. I still want to save some time, maybe the last 10 minutes to talk about Tom's game. So there's one thing that I wanted to touch on. Sorry, at this point, I'm just kind of like, just hating on this chapter. But there was that thing with O.J. Simpson's wife who was murdered. Like, did you read that? Do you guys remember that part? That's fucking bananas. Okay, so let me just read this. But y'all know O.J. Simpson, right?
Vaguely.
So he murdered his wife. I don't remember,
Mhm.
like, I remember, like, looking into it and being like, this person, like, murdered his wife. Like, he is, like, 100% guilty. And he basically got away with it. Like, that's pretty much the consensus from everyone, is that this person's, like, murdered. Like, I don't remember the details, but, like, when you look at all the evidence, you're like, yeah, 1,000%. This person's guilty as can be. Like, there's no doubt. But yeah, he got away with it. It was wild. So this is talking about the O.J. Simpson case. I'm just going to read this section. So when the case against O.J. Simpson was, this is 112. When the case against O.J. Simpson was national news, there was little discussion of the role substance abuse played in facilitating the emotional estrangement in an already dysfunctional family. While domestic violence was highlighted and everyone agrees that it was not acceptable behavior, substance abuse was not. It was not seen as a major factor that destroyed the conditions needed for positive emotional interaction. For example, it was not acceptable for anyone to talk compassionately in a manner that did not blame the victim about the possibility that Nicole Simpson had kept herself and her children in a dangerous, life-threatening environment, in part because she was not willing to sacrifice her attachment to a superficially glamorous lifestyle among the rich and famous. Behind the scenes, when they are not afraid of being seen as politically incorrect, women who are bonded with abusive, rich, and powerful men talk easily. This person was murdered. This person was murdered, and she's like, yeah, I mean, I know that like that there's rich people who are bonded with abusive, rich, and powerful men talk easily about their addiction to power and wealth. I'm like, you don't even know if this is what this person has said. This person was murdered, and you're like, I could see her just being like, oh, I just want to like be with a rich person. I'm like, Bell Hooks, like, what are you fucking doing? Both men and women remain in a dysfunctional, loveless relationship when it is materially opportune. And I'm just like, this is so fucking judgmental. This person was murdered, and she's like, I'm not victim blaming, but I am victim blaming a little bit here. I'm like,
I was gonna say this.
Just like, this person was murdered. Bell Hooks, okay? Like, this is not, why is this relevant? Like, you could have picked a rich person who wasn't murdered to make your point about rich people putting up with bullshit because they want to marry into rich families or something. You could have picked someone who wasn't murdered to make that point, and you picked the person who was murdered. Like, Bell Hooks, like...
Oh, God.
And it was like a brutal murder too. I mean, not that it should matter, like murder is murder, but it just like, yeah, that I was like, this is a lot for me right now. This chapter was a lot for me. I was like, there's a lot of judgmental shit in here. And I really do think like, it reminds me of my older self a little bit. Like, it reminds me of when I was Christian and I would just kind of like the way that I would personally like would judge people. And she talks about the good life, which is like fine, but like a lot of times Christian scholars would talk about like this like Aristotelian idea of like the good life and things like that, which is fine. That's actually not an issue, but like it just makes me, sometimes I wonder if she wanted to write a little bit more on theology instead of like something a little bit more secular. and that's why things are vague, I wonder. But there's just like some judgmental stuff that reminds me of when I was religious, where I was like kind of like towards the end of like me being Christian, I was like kind of like a progressive Christian, but there were like all these ways that I was super judgmental that I didn't understand because of the way that I practiced religion. And not saying that has to be every Christian or anything like that, but there's just like some stuff where I like have a hard time because like I think I'm so critical of the way she's judgmental because I used to be like that, and I see my old self and I'm like, never again. I'd never want to like put someone through that. And yeah, but that really bothered me. Just the way she's talking about O.J. Simpson's wife who's murdered, and she's like, not to victim blame. And I'm like, then what are you doing? You can't just, it's like when you say it with all due respect, and then you say something rude, and it's like, well, it's still not respectful just because you said that. Like, it's still rude. But yeah, any thoughts on that? I know I just kind of went off.
Yeah.
Sounds about accurate to me.
Yeah. Overall, a very sad turn of events. very disappointing. But
yeah, I've heard this criticism before, like before reading this book, like around when Bell Hooks passed away. I saw a lot of people being like, oh, you know, celebrating Bell Hooks, and then I saw like this segment of people who were saying things like, Bell Hooks says vague things that are often problematic. Like it was just sort of like this concise message, not said exactly like that, but I just saw all these people putting these things, and I like my exposure to Bell Hooks was pretty limited, really. Like you know, seeing snippets of lectures and seeing her put in a context of other you know, prominent recent feminist scholars, right? And yeah, this book, I finished it all like within a couple of days, and I was like, okay, all right. That I remember so little of it, in part because everything was so vague, and also like nothing in there feels very actionable except, you know, hey, don't hit your kids. You know, like there may be a couple other things in there that I'm omitting, but yeah, a lot of this looks like, if this is progressive for the 90s, it's like barely centrist for the moment, you know? Like that's how I feel about it. Yeah. Every time I come across a new thing that I look back into that book, I'm like, oof, okay, that's great.
For the last part, before we get into Tom's game, I just want to go over like the stuff with Monica Lewinsky. Is that okay, or is there something more that anyone wanted to add? Okay. So, yeah. Oh. Yeah. I'm not even gonna talk about that. Oh gosh, I just underlined, she talks about, oh God, I'm just gonna say this really fast. Ironically, rich who grow greedier and overprotective of their wealth are increasingly as perpetually stressed and dissatisfied as the greedy poor who suffer endless cravings. And like, gosh, there's this show that we watch called The Majestic Gemstones, and like there's like this really funny moment where this like family like won like $50,000 and they're like really excited. And the Majestic Gemstones is like this family that's like really rich, and they're like looking at this family who just got $50,000, and they're like really excited, and they're like, $50,000, that's not even that much. And they're like, poor people are obsessed with money. And I just like thought it was so funny. I'm like, that's like literally what this sounds like to me right now. Like, poor people are just obsessed with money. Like, I know to be charitable, she probably just is using the word greed. She's probably trying to use the word greed as just like people, just like the culture, there's like a culture of wanting material things. And so like we all want material things because of this culture. And so she's kind of like trying to attribute the word greed to that. And maybe is trying to not say it in a judgmental way, to try to be trying to be charitable to her, but like, you know, if that's what's going on, you need to really define your terms and like make that really clear instead of just like having me to like grasp at straws and be like, well, maybe she didn't mean it in such a mean way, like, you know, God, I hope not. Like, okay, I'm gonna get to the Monica Lewinsky thing. Sorry, I just had to read that since we're flipping through. Okay, I think this is it. Yes, so this is on page 124. So she says, when our president exploits his power and consensually... at least she acknowledges it's consensual and consensually seduces a young woman in the government's employ, he gives public expression to this greed. And I'm like, greed for what, Bell Hooks? People are horny. Like, okay, just like, if this is consensual and if like, you know, all partners, sorry, I'm Polly. If all partners involved are cool with it, then everyone just needs to calm the fuck down and just like let people do what they want to fucking do, okay? Literally, like, sex is the reason why we're here, is the reason why we exist. People need to stop talking about it like it's a sin. Like, sorry, so I was
also
gonna say,
just gonna point out, consensually seduces.
right?
You know?
Stop
like, there
it.
isn't an implicit massive power dynamic that she's calling attention to while stating consensually. Like, come on, you know, is like, yeah, okay.
I'm just like going off right now.
What is she trying to say? What is
words mean things. You can't just put two things that are kind of contradictory and just smush them together. Be like, yeah, greed. She was greedy, I guess.
Like, I can, like, if I'm thinking consensual seduction, two people get together and they're like, hey, listen, I want you to seduce me. How do you feel about that? The other person's like, oh, I could seduce you. How's that sound? And they're like, cool, let's do that. And then you have the theater of consensual seduction. I don't think that's what Bell Hooks was going for there. Like,
probably
oh
not.
my gosh.
That really bothered me. Oh my gosh, in my notes I just wrote stop.
Please stop.
Okay, but there's more still. So that so many of our nation's citizens felt his misuse of power was simply the way things are done, that he simply had the misfortune to get caught, is further testimony that the politics of greed are condoned. They exemplify the greedy mindset that threatens to consume our capacity to love, and with it our capacity to sacrifice on behalf of those we love. But it's just like, okay, again, this isn't even the whole thing I wanted to read. It's just like she hasn't explained like how this is greedy, because again, like, I think this is probably just fine. Concurrently, the young woman involved manipulates facts and details and ultimately prostitutes herself by selling her story for material gain because she is greedy for fame and money, and society condones this get-rich-quick scheme. Her greed is even more intense because she also wants to be seen as a victim. With the boldness of any con artist working in the capitalist addiction to fantasy, she attempts to rewrite the script of their consensual exchange of pleasures so that it can appear to be a love story. Like, I wonder if she ever apologized about this fucking bullshit. Like, seriously, like, you know, like, all of America, like, I don't remember this because I was a lot younger when this happened, but I still remember hearing about it afterwards. Like, the way that America just, like, shit on Monica Lewinsky because they were like, you're a whore, you're a prostitute, when she's doing something that people do all the time, and it was consensual. She didn't rape anyone, and she also wasn't raped herself. This was, like, a consensual relationship between two adults. And so, yeah, she's probably gonna have a story where she's like, oh, like, it's about love, just to try to take the heat off people calling her a whore. And Bell Hooks is calling her greedy. Like I don't, like, I hope Bell Hooks apologized before she died. Like this is like just really like just so gross to me, and I don't.
Just a quick phone call.
The way that people talked about Monica Lewinsky was so messed up, and yeah, and just also like all the rape allegations that politicians get, and people don't even fucking bat an eye. And here is someone consensually having sexual relationships with another adult, You know, again, we don't know if Hillary consented to this or not, but I also wouldn't be surprised if that's the case, because a lot of politicians do have these, like, you know, like a lot of politicians kind of will have these like open style relationships, but they can't because it's looked down on to have anything like that. So like we don't know all the details, but we do know at the very least two consenting adults, and yet there's like all these, you know, it's just so sexist. It's so sexist the way that Bell
That's
Hooks,
the
a
thing.
feminist, saying that she's prostituting herself in a feminist book. I'm just like, I can't, and that's why I can't read this book anymore, and I'm putting it down. So, yeah.
How about she just rewrites that part and instead makes it about those weirdly sexual fast food commercials?
Oh, like the ones where you like eat like a burger and there's someone's like in a bikini for Carl's Jr.
Yeah.
Those always made me want a burger.
The new, extremely large Taco Bell.
It's just
Try
really
to
weird
wrap
to
your
watch
head
those
around.
commercials whenever you're
Yes.
asexual.
I'm not even like attracted to this person, but there's something about her I'm like, I want to eat a burger because someone in a bikini is eating a burger. I don't know. I don't know.
You know, it
wanna eat a
actually does
bikini.
work. It just looks so weird, and it's just such a strange
They
feeling to
are
watch it when you
weird.
have no sexual attraction to anyone.
Yeah, I mean, they are just weird commercials. It's like really dramatic, and it's also like, why? Like, yeah, it's like kind of confusing to see.
Car commercials just confound me all the time, because half the time I don't know what the commercial is for, because it's just really weird, like James Bond crap, and then at the very end it's like Peugeot or Citroën, and I was like, oh, this was an ad for a car. Okay.
Yeah, you're like,
So
oh, I
buying
thought
a
this was
car-
like a perfume commercial because it's so sensual, but it's like,
Yeah.
it's a car. Okay.
Or a holiday commercial. It's like, oh, okay, so it's a thing with an engine that transports people. I don't understand what's so liberating and empowering for. I get it.
Like, I would
Yeah.
like to see
Oh,
that car
also, I'm
commercial
gonna end the
format.
stream here for anyone
Oh.
who is watching. Sorry, just gonna
Oh.
stop that.